All right, so in this part of the review, we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between viruses, worms, Trojans, and the like. And I think that, for me, it really starts with being able to really jump in and identify what are the different stages in a virus's life. So when we open up the door and start talking about different techniques that attackers use, it's very much cyclic in nature. You remember last week we talked about the software design and software development life cycle, very similar in creating a virus in that a lot of thought goes into the way the virus will function, the way that it will attack a system. And so a lot of times what we see is that a lot of these attackers that are out there now will spend a lot of time up front sharpening the saw and coming up with a design that is built in either a cross-platform language or in some sort of construction kit. And so those construction kits that we usually will see are things that you can download. And I think that anybody who is interested in creating a virus really, if you're downloading a kit to create a virus, that should be a warning in itself, because who knows what infection is in that piece of software that you download. But there are construction kits that you can download to create viruses for. And so with those construction kits, you can actually go through methodically and tell it exactly what you want it to do, what kind of payload it has, what kind of replication that it might use, how you want to launch it. And really the idea is to try to obfuscate it in a way that it can go under the radar and not be detected. So you can kind of see in this cyclic approach that many of the stages here should be fairly straightforward, and as we discuss them, probably familiar as you have heard some of these things in the past and maybe seen them on the news or something like that. So in this case, the virus, somebody codes the virus in some sort of programming language or construction kit. They bundle it up and then they launch it. And once they launch it, if it is not something that has been already seen in the wild, then the antivirus won't detect it. Usually antivirus are signature based. So typically if there's not a signature out, we call that a 0 day. And until a countermeasure can be developed, usually what we'll see is that the viruses will remain undetected. And usually it takes a while for companies to go ahead and mitigate things. But once it's detected, then the antivirus software will start to incorporate that in some of the updates and then hopefully put it into quarantine or eliminate it altogether. We've seen quite a bit of ransomware in the last couple of years. And, for us here at Cyber Protects, that's something that we have specialized in. We've been on a contract with the Department of Homeland Security and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, to deliver some tabletop exercises all over the nation. And last year we delivered 5 in the state of New York. This year we delivered 1 in the Tennessee Valley, but really it harped on ransomware, and ransomware being the next generation of the types of malware that's out there. So I use a word there, malware, that really stands for malicious software, because it does have a payload, ransomware, and that payload will replicate and encrypt everything on an organization's system or network. And we've seen some pretty nasty ones that we've been personally firsthand knowledge involved in that have found a way in and then been able to enumerate the entire network, encrypt every asset on that network, so laptops, desktops, smartphones, and really it is quite a nasty piece of malware that when ransomware attacks, and the attackers will typically send a ransom note that says that you have 48 hours to pay us this amount of money, and if you don't, then everything is going to be encrypted, and they'll even do a good faith give you a key to unencrypt things. So for purposes of your exam, I would anticipate something like ransomware being on there. So know that the attacker holds the keys to your kingdom at ransom by typically an RSA 2048-bit encryption. And mathematicians say that type of encryption using the 2048-bit asymmetric key in RSA would take an advanced computing cluster nearly 1 million years to decrypt if it was possible. So the chances of you actually finding a key with ransomware and being able to decrypt it yourself are slim to none, if at all. So ransomware is something that typically we will see show up on the exam. And usually it follows a similar type of life cycle where in that particular case with ransomware, they essentially are opening up themselves to being caught for about 48 hours typically. And you either pay it or you don't. And if you don't pay it, then usually the corporation will start an IT project that is unfunded and you're unprepared for, that essentially you'll have to rebuild every machine, every domain controller, every piece of asset that you have in your organization. So it's really a massive, massive undertaking. Whereas the ransomware people typically will look for you to pay them in Bitcoin. And usually it's somewhere in the neighborhood of between $40,000 and $60,000 of a ransom note. So I say that because that's one of the most popular ones that we see in the marketplace now. Another one that we typically will see is this one that's called a macro virus. The word itself here should, for anybody that's used Windows for a long time, and specifically any of the Office applications, you may be familiar with the word macro, because inside of Word or Excel or PowerPoint, you can actually go through and create these things called macros. And these macros use a native Microsoft programming language called VBA, Visual Basic for Applications, that you can embed scripts inside of these Office documents. So a lot of times what you'll see is when somebody sends you an Office document now, it'll say macros have been disabled. Do you trust the source? If you trust the source, then go ahead and enable the different documents that you may be sent. And in this case, the macro viruses, usually macros were created for helping with automation, whether it's taking numbers in an Excel spreadsheet, or maybe having a timing on a PowerPoint document to, if you were doing a presentation, you can create a macro to every 6 or 7 seconds, turn it to the next slide through automation that way. And what attackers have done is taking that macro that is supposed to be helpful and made it nefarious in nature by embedding some nastiness in those VBA documents. So you may see, and one of the ones that we typically will see is a macro virus on the exam. So keep that in mind as you go through and continue to prepare for this. Another type of attack that we usually will see is a virus that is pretty clever when you think about it. This is kind of like, I usually jokingly here will call it the X-Men of viruses, because it will go through and mutate, which from a programming standpoint, being an expert programmer, that's pretty impressive that somebody can create something that has many forms, going back to the root words here, morph meaning to change, poly meaning many, so changing many times, it's able to mutate. These are really, really clever, and that the engine that is built on top of these viruses allows it to, each time that it's executed, it will change itself just a little bit, that it will go undetected. Now, we haven't seen one of these in a little while, but essentially each of the signatures files that any of the viruses will come with is, once we understand that it is a virus, we'll go ahead and get a signature or a hash of that file type. And then each time that a system is scanned, or an email is scanned, it will look for known signatures of that. And the thing that's really interesting about a polymorphic virus is that each time that it runs, it will actually go through and change the entire code base that it has in order to allow the document or the exe to be different. So each time it will be a different file that affords you a different hash value, which is kind of neat if you think about it. If I could actually use that word when I'm describing a virus, but the fact that it mutates, having many forms and polymorphism, and usually it will run in the RAM. Typically, these are pretty nasty. We haven't seen one of these in quite a little while. A lot of times what we hear people talk about, or at least some of the questions that we see, is what's the difference between a virus and a worm? And the difference that typically I usually will tell people is kind of like with humans, the same sort of thing. Viruses need a host to attach to, whereas a worm, all it needs is a network connection and does not take any human interaction. So usually worms will be a direct attack on the availability of any type of computing resources. So that's usually the distinction between a virus and a worm, is that viruses, let me go ahead and just make a note of this for you guys here. Typically we see viruses are needing a host to attach to, whereas a worm just needs a open network connection. Viruses can maintain latency or maintain. I'm sorry, they can maintain a way that you won't see them, and by doing that, go undetected for a very, very long time. Whereas a worm, immediately, if a worm is released on a network, you will lose your functionality and your bandwidth. The availability of it will immediately get degraded. Sometimes we hear a keyword that you can see down here called this thing that's a botnet. You may have heard of that before. And another name for the different bots that are on that botnet is a zombie. And so the zombie is really a machine that has been compromised, that is now being able to be a sum of a whole in the botnet that allows an attacker to have, let's say, 1,000 different nodes that have been compromised, or 1,000 different laptops or desktops that have been compromised, to potentially attack all at once a particular target on the internet. And by doing that, those zombies really make the botnet very, very effective whenever they're going through and launching the attack on availability. And I say that because you can see here, the definition that usually we will see is that a worm is really a special type of virus, but it can replicate itself and does not need to attach itself. Whereas a virus needs a host. You remember me saying that? Any type of computing systems resources, just like a network connection, that's all you need for a worm to transmit. Whereas a virus, you absolutely need it to, like a Word document or a click event. Something needs to happen in order for it to spread. So we've seen a number of different types of viruses, a number of different types of worms. Really, just at a very high level for this exam is all you need to know for the differences between the two. Another thing that typically you will see one question on the exam for is this thing that's called a Trojan. And, if you think about the ancient story of Troy and how in the story, a lot of times what you hear that, the ancient Greeks were, under siege, and it was difficult for their attackers to be able to go in and penetrate all the different protections that they had. And so, the idea here is that you can hide a piece of malicious software inside of something that is seemingly unsuspecting of anything being malicious. So, in the Homer's Iliad, you may have had a chance to read that. The story really comes down to the battle between the different kingdoms of Troy and Sparta. And in that, the Spartan king and the Trojan prince, they fight over a beautiful lady, and the Helen of Troy in that particular case goes back to Troy in a way that was not favorable, and because of that, all hell broke loose in that particular story. So the story is that it was hidden in a huge Trojan horse, a wooden Trojan horse, and inside there was a bunch of soldiers there waiting to just be released. So similar to that, in that particular scenario, the way that this particular one will go through and launch itself is, you can see over on the left-hand side, we have an attacker, and then different people on the right-hand side who are infected with the various Trojans here. And inside of an apparently harmless type of data set, like a Word document or a PDF, the attackers can get control and cause damage to a person's system by basically communicating via personal documents or getting personal documents from people's machines, maybe even doing some nastiness like deleting all the files, or even getting pictures or private messages. And so in this case, that is what a Trojan is. Good chance you will see Trojans on your exam. Another thing to think about here is the difference between an overt and a covert channel. An overt and a covert channel. So an overt channel is a legitimate communication path. It's legitimate. That's overt. Whereas a covert is a channel that violates security policy. And in this particular case right here, you can see that Trojan would be using a covert channel because it's being hidden. Whereas an overt would actually use a legitimate communication path. So things like, games or any type of programs. And in this case, this is kind of neat, what I'm about to show you here, if you've never seen it before. But let's say that we have, a game that you download on your computer, or even an app that you download on your phone. A lot of times what attackers will do is they'll use these overt and covert channels to deliver the payload. So check this out real quick. They will take what's called a wrapper, and I'll just put little quotes around this. This wrapper will take a program like, let's say, chess, Angry Birds, or Flappy Birds, or whatever the program is, and it will attach some nastiness to it. And in this particular case, it's pretty clever the way that this works, is because this right here is a working program, this chess.exe. What an attacker will do is they'll get a copy of the chess.exe, they'll reverse engineer it, decompile it, and then add the nastiness to that particular piece of software, and then recompile it together, and it will still work. So you can still go through and play chess, but you can see here that the original chess game was 90 kilobytes, and the Trojan was 20 kilobytes, and together now the new working malicious chess is 110. So when you download this, either via the App Store, or maybe you get it online or whatever, a lot of times what we'll see is that no one will even know the difference between a real program and a nefarious one, because this still works and it'll still function. You'll still be able to play chess. And so the two programs are wrapped together, put into a single file. And because of that, if you aren't running any type of antivirus software, or if there's not a signature out for this particular type of Trojan, then it's very likely that it will bypass any type of security mechanisms that you have and allow you to execute that in memory. And if you do, then now this will still allow you to play the game, but then it does whatever the payload is of it on your system. That could be, stealing files and the like. So just keep that in mind as you're going through and doing it. You may see something like a Trojan or a wrapper asked as well. So last thing I think that I want to talk about in this regard is the different ways that we can detect viruses. We can scan, and you're probably familiar with purchasing an antivirus tool that scans regularly. One of the things that you can also do is file integrity checking. And in Windows, many of the System32 files that are the ones that govern the Windows environment are needing to be approved and have a file integrity check done by Windows prior to you being able to put it into that System32. So integrity checking typically will need some sort of file signature that's been approved by Microsoft in a Windows environment. So that's an integrity check mechanism. There's also other programs that are out there. One that I think is quite popular for file integrity on the Windows is the one that's called Tripwire. You may have heard of Tripwire before, or the file verification just native inside of Windows. So those are two things to think about whenever you're doing a file integrity. And lastly here, you can intercept any type of requests that are written to the disk to make sure that any of the I/O between you and the application that's running and the disk is also scanned. Each one of these does give a little bit of overhead, so it may slow your system down, but at least you're doing something to try to detect these.